remembering the first North Dakotan to die in the Vietnam War. Virgil Greaney was killed by a Viet Cong terrorist while helping a village install a water supply. Years later, his family struggled to understand what happened. This is Tracy Briggs. Welcome to this episode of Back Then, brought to us by Discover Jamestown. To learn more, go to discoverjamestownnd.com. Again, this is a special episode of Back Then. Normally, our podcasts happen on Wednesdays, and we talk about just general history. But for the last couple of days, we're paying special attention to the Vietnam War and Vietnam veterans, because on Sunday, September 11th, for the first time in the history of the Veterans Honor Flight of North Dakota and Minnesota, the majority of veterans going on the trip to Washington, D.C. are those that served during the Vietnam era. I'm lucky enough that I get to fly with the group, so I will be doing stories from Washington, D.C. from September 11th through the 13th. You can find those stories on inform.com. But starting yesterday, we wanted to do something kind of special and mark the transition of the flight into serving these Vietnam veterans by recognizing the first Minnesotan to die in the war and the first North Dakotan to die in the war. Yesterday, we told you the story of the first Minnesotan who actually grew up in the Grand Forks area but lived in Moorhead when he died in the Vietnam War. But today, we're going to talk about the first North Dakotan to die in the war. He is a man from Rugby, North Dakota named Major Virgil Greaney. And this podcast is also a little special. Normally, I will write the stories that I talk about here on the podcast, and I have written part of this story, but a bulk of this story was actually written nearly 50 years ago, and I will get to that in just a minute. But first, let's get started. If you make a special trip to Rugby, North Dakota, or are just passing through, you can't miss it. The town's claim to fame. It's right there, emblazoned on the 21-foot-high, 6-foot-wide monument set on a heart-shaped foundation. It reads, Geographic Center of North America, Rugby, North Dakota. It's a popular tourist spot for those looking to experience what it feels like to be dead center between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. But sadly, Rugby holds another distinction. One of its hometown boys was the first North Dakotan to be killed in the Vietnam War. When I did my research and found out about Rugby native Major Virgil R. Greaney's death by a Viet Cong terrorist on September 25, 1964, I set out to write a story about him because he was the first of 199 North Dakotans to die in the war. I did a similar story for the first Minnesotan who was killed in the war, Bob Larson of Moorhead. But upon my research in the Forum archives, I found another reporter, almost 50 years ago, beat me to the punch. In the spring of 1966, Forum writer and photographer Cal Olson was sent to Vietnam to cover the war. He set out to learn more about the growing conflict and maybe even find what he called some big answers about the fight. He left Fargo right after the infamous blizzard of '66 to spend 4 weeks in a hot, humid war zone half a world away. He interviewed local troops to see what life was like for them in places like Nha Trang and Bien Ho, and he wanted to introduce upper Midwesterners to the people and culture of Vietnam, one newspaper page at a time. The stories I read were riveting, but also, as a journalist who has spent most of my career working with all of the modern conveniences from satellites to cell phones to the internet, I marveled at how Olson had to get his stories from Saigon back to downtown Fargo via airmail to New York City, dictating over telephone lines, or sending photos through special long-distance Associated Press wire photo lines. But he did it. Olson returned safely to Fargo in late April of 1966, admittedly tired and frustrated that he had not come up with any of those big answers about Vietnam. But he wrote instead that he was hopeful he answered a few of the little questions. By 1973, when the war was nearly wrapped up, Olson and others at the Forum put together another special report. It was in this report I found Olson's story about Greaney. I planned to read it, maybe pick out a few quotes, then do an original story. But you know what they say, why reinvent the wheel? And I would like to add, especially when that wheel is nearly perfect. What is printed below is Olson's original story about Greene, including a visit with his still grieving parents nearly 10 years after his death. I think this story by Cal Olson perfectly summarizes the feeling many rural North Dakotans, like the Greeneys, felt at the loss of their sons in a war some struggled to understand. So here is that story by Cal Olson from the Sunday Forum, January 28, 1973. These are his words. North Dakota Major Virgil R. Greaney was the first North Dakotan to die in the Vietnamese fighting. His death came so long ago that the scars of his passing are now almost invisible. Major Greaney was killed September 25, 1964, by a Viet Cong terrorist. He died unarmed in a village where he had gone with an American civilian expert to help install a water supply. He was the 238th American to die in the Vietnamese conflict. Today, Major Greeney's widow and 3 children live in Washington. His parents, the Raymond Greeneys, still live in a fieldstone house on the south edge of Rugby. They have lived almost 8.5 years with the stark reality of Virgil's death. Their mementos include a couple of pictures of him in Army uniform, a telegram, 2 newspaper clippings, an officer's candidate school yearbook, and a copy of the March 1966 Reader's Digest. If uneventful can be applied to anyone's early life, it can be applied to Virgil Greaney. Born in Rugby, November 26, 1930, he was graduated from high school here 18 years later, attended the University of Minnesota, and entered the Army in 1951. While in the Army, he received his BA degree from the University of Nebraska. Virgil made a tour of duty in Korea, and in 1956 he was married in Seattle, Washington. His wife, Loyal June, and the children followed Greaney on assignment, including a 3-year stint in Ethiopia. Virgil departed for Vietnam on August 25, 1964, leaving his family in Rugby. A month later, his wife received a telegram. It read, "The Secretary of the Army has asked me to express his deep regret that your husband died in Vietnam, 25 September 1964. Cause unknown. Information available indicates that he was in a jeep into which fragmentation grenades were thrown. When additional information is received, we'll advise." However, the details of Virgil's death were slow in coming. Some parts of the story filtered home in a newspaper clipping forwarded from Salem, Oregon, by a former Rugby man. The clipping was an interview of a Salem native, Chester A. Richardson, who had served in Vietnam as a civilian expert with the U.S. Agency for International Development, or AID. Richardson told how he and Virgil had driven to the village of Dong Nhi, 5 miles north of Saigon, where they were to examine a civilian assistance project planned by AID. As they entered the village, they came under attack by a black-clad youth, a guerrilla terrorist, who tossed a grenade into their vehicle. The grenade killed Virgil and dazed Richardson, who fled into the village as the terrorists threw 3 more grenades at them. Not too long ago, Virgil's parents talked with a visitor about their son's death. Mrs. Greaney brought out a dog-eared copy of Reader's Digest, dated March 1966. She says, "I was reading this magazine one day and came on a story about Richardson. Although the story didn't name Virgil, it gave corroborated details of their son's death, in most points confirming their earlier information. Virgil's body lies in a military cemetery at Fort Lawton, Washington. Not long ago, as the fighting drew to a close in Vietnam, Virgil's parents talked about the war over coffee in their neat and homey dwelling. Raymond, who drove a bulk oil truck for Farmers Union, is retired now. He's a rock hound. Samples of his hobby decorate one wall and a coffee table. The Greeneys are a quiet couple. They offered no opinions on the conduct of the Vietnam War until their visitor asked them. They considered the question soberly. Mrs. Greaney replied first, "It's an unpopular war now, but you still have to protect your country." Mr. Greaney said, "Virgil thought it was the thing to do. He volunteered. 'Twouldn't do for everyone to run off to Canada." Mrs. Greaney, "Or else we might as well all move to Canada." A pause. A long pause. Virgil's father picked up on the thread. "Perhaps we shouldn't have fought." Virgil's mother replied, But when we make treaties, we have to live up to them. We got into these troubles, and somebody has to, another pause. Raymond Greene stared at his coffee cup, and Virgil's mother gazed downward at the tablecloth. She spoke again. The only thing, a person wouldn't think it would last that long. Again, we will be bringing you stories of other Vietnam veterans and their trip to Washington, D.C. to see all of the memorials on September 11th through the 13th. Be sure to tune into that on inform.com. Thanks for listening. And again, many thanks to our sponsor, Discover Jamestown. To learn more, go to discoverjamestownd.com. Forum Communications is proud to be part of The Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org.